can destroy buildings, burn files, and bury evidence, but history has a way of digging itself back out. Long after the fall of Nazi Germany, investigators kept stumbling onto places and objects that felt less like leftovers of war and more like warnings from it. Some of those discoveries changed what historians believed about the war. Others opened doors that many believed should have stayed closed. And the shocking ones are still ahead, because these World War II finds grow more terrifying from here. Number 20. Die Glocke and Secret Technology. You might think a story about flying saucers and secret propulsion systems belongs in science fiction, but when you look at how far Nazi scientists were willing to go in their search for superweapons, these projects become far less surprising. According to accounts first published by Polish investigative journalist Igor Witkowski in the early 2000s, and later explored by British-American author Nick Cook in his book The Hunt for Zero Point, Nazi SS researchers operating somewhere within the Riese complex were developing a device unlike anything in conventional weapons science. It was described as a large bell-shaped metallic object, roughly 9 feet wide and 12 feet tall. Inside were 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with a violet-colored metallic liquid the scientists called Serum 525. When activated, it allegedly emitted intense radiation and produced strange physical effects on nearby material and living tissue. Claimed accounts described early test subjects, both plants and animals, decomposing at an accelerated rate. Technicians reportedly suffered severe radiation poisoning. According to the post-war accounts, the SS executed the majority of the scientists working on the project before Germany surrendered to prevent the technology from being captured. The device itself reportedly vanished, either flown out on an aircraft or moved through an unknown route. No physical evidence has been recovered, and no Third Reich documentation explicitly confirms the project. But investigators have consistently found one stubborn detail they can't easily explain away. Several of the SS officers associated with the alleged project were tracked fleeing Germany in the war's final days, and their files were immediately classified by the CIA upon capture. That detail has never been fully explained. Number 19. The Riese Complex. Here's something that keeps historians up at night. Starting in 1943, the Nazis began carving 7 separate tunnel systems into the Owl Mountains of Lower Silesia, today's southwestern Poland. The project was called Riese, which means giant. It consumed staggering resources, hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks, thousands of tons of concrete, and the forced labor of roughly 13,000 people prisoners from Poland, Russia, Czechoslovakia, Italian POWs, and concentration camp inmates transferred from the nearby Gross-Rosen camp. Estimates suggest that about 5,000 of those workers died during construction. Here's the unsettling part. Almost all records and documentation for the project were destroyed before Germany surrendered. So when Allied and Soviet forces eventually found the tunnels, nobody could tell them what they were actually for. Nazi armaments minister Albert Speer and 2 other senior officers later wrote in their memoirs that it was meant to be a Führerhauptquartier, a command headquarters for Hitler. But researchers have pointed out that the tunnels were far too complex and far too massive for that one purpose alone. Some sections appear designed for heavy industrial work. Others suggest ammunition or weapons storage. A few researchers have argued the complex was intended for production of the so-called wonder weapons. Nobody has ever been able to say for certain. Most of the tunnels remain sealed, flooded, or structurally too dangerous to enter fully. And somewhere inside that mountain, according to persistent accounts, something far stranger may have been happening. Number 18. The Berlin Flak Towers. After the Royal Air Force bombed Berlin in 1940, Hitler personally ordered the construction of 3 colossal anti-aircraft towers to protect the capital. The result was something the modern world had never seen before. Each flak tower complex came in two parts, a massive combat tower and a smaller fire control tower connected to it. The Generation 1 combat towers were roughly 230 square feet and 128 feet tall. That's a 13-story building made of steel-reinforced concrete with walls up to 11 feet thick. Construction of each tower took about 6 months, and the German national rail schedule was actually altered to prioritize shipments of concrete, steel, and timber to the construction sites. Each tower was armed with 8 twin-barrel 128mm guns and dozens of lighter anti-aircraft cannons capable of firing 8,000 rounds per minute in a 360-degree arc. They were also designed as civilian shelters built to hold 10,000 people, though during the final Battle of Berlin up to 30,000 civilians crammed into a single tower. When Soviet forces arrived, they found the towers virtually impregnable. Their largest artillery pieces, 203mm howitzers, barely scratched the outer walls. The Soviets eventually bypassed them and negotiated surrenders. After the war, demolition crews discovered the towers were so solidly built that controlled demolition was nearly impossible. Several still stand in Berlin today, but as massive as these towers were above ground, the most shocking discoveries were happening far below the surface. Number 17. Art in the Altaussee salt mine. In the spring of 1945, a team of Allied officers, known as the Monuments Men, made their way into a salt mine tucked into the Austrian Alps near the village of Altaussee. What they found inside was almost incomprehensible. The Nazis had been using the mine since 1943 as a storage vault for looted artwork from across occupied Europe: paintings, drawings, sculptures, tapestries, furniture, weapons, coins, and entire library collections. At the time of discovery, the mine contained 6,577 paintings, 137 sculptures, and 484 crates of additional objects. The artwork had been gathered under a program called Sonderauftrag Linz Special Commission Linz, with the direct intention of filling a planned Führer Museum in Hitler's hometown of Linz, Austria, a museum that was never built. Among the pieces inside were some of the most celebrated works in Western art history, including the Bruges Madonna by Michelangelo and the renowned Ghent altarpiece. But as the Monuments Men were pushing through the tunnels, they discovered something that turned this from a recovery mission into a race against total destruction. Regional Nazi Party chief August E. Gruber had already placed large wooden crates inside the mine. Those crates were labeled "Marble Do Not Drop." They weren't marble, they were bombs. Hitler's Nero decree had ordered everything inside destroyed. The miners who worked the mine ultimately blocked the detonation, and the art survived. Number 16. The Amber Room's fate. Built in the early 18th century for the Prussian royal family and later gifted to Tsar Peter the Great of Russia, the Amber Room was one of the most extraordinary decorative objects ever created. Floor-to-ceiling panels of hand-carved amber, gold leaf, and mirrored glass, covering an area of roughly 590 square feet and valued in today's money at well over $500 million. In 1941, German forces seized it from the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, dismantled every panel, packed it all into 27 crates, and shipped it west to Königsberg Castle in what is now Kaliningrad, Russia. That's where its trail goes cold. When Soviet forces captured Königsberg in April 1945, the Amber Room was gone. The crates had vanished sometime in the final months of the war. Investigators pursued theories for decades: that the crates burned in a fire inside the castle, that they were loaded onto a ship that was subsequently sunk, or that they were transported west, possibly into the Riese tunnel system in the Owl Mountains, which, as you'll remember, has never been fully explored. In 1997, German investigators recovered 2 panels from the original room, traced to a family whose relative had served in Königsberg. That suggested at least some crates made it out. But the bulk of the Amber Room has never been recovered, making it one of the most consequential missing finds of the entire war. And not far away, another discovery was about to show just how close Germany had come to changing the war in an entirely different direction. Number 15. Haigerloch Reactor Cave. The small German town of Haigerloch is not the kind of place you'd expect to find a nuclear reactor. It has a beautiful old-style church on a rocky hill, a medieval castle, and streets made of small stones. But in 1944, underneath that church, in a natural cave carved further by engineers, Nazi Germany's most advanced nuclear scientists quietly assembled an experimental reactor made of uranium cubes suspended in heavy water. Their goal was to achieve a controlled nuclear chain reaction, the same fundamental step that the American Manhattan Project was racing toward on the other side of the world. When Allied forces from the classified Altaussee mission entered Haigerloch in April 1945, the scientists had already fled. They had buried 659 uranium cubes in a field next to the church. They hid the heavy water in barrels in the cellar of an old mill. The scientific documents classified nuclear physics research reports were stuffed into a cesspit behind a physicist's house. Werner Heisenberg himself reportedly rode away on a bicycle with a backpack full of radioactive uranium blocks. The Altaussee team dug everything up, confiscated it all, and blew up the cave's inner vessel. When American scientists analyzed what the Germans had actually built, their conclusion was uncomfortable. The reactor had not achieved a chain reaction, but it was closer than most people realized. Germany had been working toward an atomic bomb. They just hadn't gotten there in time. And waiting in a salt mine further east, something the Allies found would show exactly how much gold and wealth the regime had tried to save for itself. Number 14. Merkers salt mine treasure. In early April 1945, a patrol from the U.S. Third Army's 4th Infantry Division was pushing through the town of Merkers in central Germany when they stopped 2 French displaced workers on the road. The women casually mentioned that a nearby salt mine was holding something valuable. The soldiers followed up. What they found, roughly 2,000 feet underground, broke every record for wartime treasure recovery. The Reichsbank had transferred the entirety of Germany's remaining gold reserves into the mine, along with foreign currency, SS loot confiscated from concentration camp victims, and hundreds of paintings and sculptures removed from Berlin's major museums ahead of the Allied advance. On April 12th, Generals Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton descended into the mine in person to see it for themselves. Patton reportedly went pale. What they cataloged inside included over 100 tons of gold bars and coins, hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks in paper currency, over 1,000 bags of foreign banknotes, and thousands of works of art. All of it had been moved there in secret, and it almost stayed there. But as American forces were counting gold underground, Allied investigators somewhere else were about to discover that Germany had been running an equally extraordinary and far more sinister operation on the surface. Number 13. U-864 and the toxic cargo. On February 9, 1945, a British submarine called HMS Venturer was quietly patrolling the freezing waters near Fedja Island off the Norwegian coast when its operators picked up a faint sound. Another submarine was nearby running submerged, engines temporarily cut to avoid detection. What followed was the only confirmed underwater duel in naval history in which both submarines were completely submerged. Venturer fired 4 torpedoes in a staggered pattern to form a 3-dimensional spread through the water. At least one connected. The German U-864 broke apart and sank, taking all 73 crew members down with it. Decades later, in 2003, Norwegian divers located the wreck. When they surveyed the cargo, the full weight of what had been stopped became clear. The U-864 had been on a mission codenamed Operation Caesar, carrying 1,857 steel flasks loaded with about 67 tons of liquid metallic mercury, along with jet engine components and missile guidance systems, all bound for Japan to help continue the war in the Pacific. By 2003, some of those steel flasks had already begun to corrode and leak. Norway placed the wreck under a restricted exclusion zone, and in 2016 engineers executed a precision rock dumping operation to stabilize the seabed around the wreck and prevent a landslide that could crack the remaining flasks open. As of today, the U-864 and its toxic cargo still lie on the floor of the North Sea. And buried in a very different kind of mountain, something equally astonishing was waiting to be found, something that had been almost too strange to believe. Number 12. The Nazi gold train rumor. In February 1945, as the Soviet Red Army swept across Lower Silesia toward the Polish city of Wałbrzych, witnesses described something unusual. A heavily guarded freight train rolled into the mountainside tunnel network beneath Kasiaz Castle and never came out. SS officers sealed the entrance. Demolition charges followed. The mouth of the tunnel collapsed under tons of rock. What was on that train? According to accounts that have been cross-referenced with Soviet interrogation records and Allied intelligence files on Nazi evacuation movements, the answer may be roughly 300 tons of gold, silver, jewelry, artworks, and potentially pieces of the missing amber room. In September 2015, two men, Polish researcher Piotr Koper and German partner Andreas Richter, publicly claimed they had used ground-penetrating radar to locate a buried train at a specific location along the old railway line near Wałbrzych. The Polish government took it seriously enough to mount a formal geological survey. The survey in 2015 and 2016 found no confirmed train. But here's what the investigators also found. The tunnel network in that area has enormous sections that are flooded, structurally collapsed, or still inaccessible. Archival records confirm that massive shipments of Reich property were transported into Lower Silesia in the war's final weeks. The train itself has never been definitively ruled out, and the tunnels are still not fully explored. Number 11. Wolf's Lair Underground Maze. You'd think a military headquarters in the middle of a war would be heavily visible, fortified, imposing, impossible to miss. Wolf's Lair was the exact opposite. Nestled in a dense forest near the small town of Katorzyn in what is now northeastern Poland, the compound was so thoroughly camouflaged that Allied aircraft flew over it for years without ever spotting it. Constructed between 1940 and 1944, the complex grew into a sprawling world of its own, over 80 buildings, including bunkers, barracks, 2 airfields, a railroad station, its own power plant, water supply, and communication systems. Hitler spent over 800 days here, directing the entire Eastern Front. His personal bunker had a concrete roof over 7 meters thick with a protective layer of gravel on top. And because there were no windows, a complex ventilation system had to pump fresh air in constantly. When the Red Army closed in during January 1945, the Germans detonated the entire compound rather than surrender it. About 8 tons of TNT were used to destroy a single bunker. Witnesses reported that ice cracked on nearby lakes from the force of the blasts. The foundations had been sunk 5.5 meters into the ground, and the concrete blocks that flew into the air weighed tens of tons. When Polish and Soviet investigators finally pushed through the rubble, they found a labyrinthine system of underground tunnels connecting the bunkers, a subterranean web stretching underneath the entire complex that nobody had fully mapped. Number 10. Horten Ho 229. In 1943, Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring issued a design challenge. Build a bomber capable of carrying 1,000 kilograms of bombs over 1,000 kilometers at 1,000 kilometers per hour. Every established manufacturer said it was impossible. 2 brothers, Reimar and Walter Horten, said they could do it, and their approach was unlike anything in aviation at the time. They designed a jet-powered flying wing with no fuselage, no tail, just a pure blended wing with 2 Junkers jet engines buried inside it. Göring gave them 500,000 Reichsmarks to develop it. An unpowered glider prototype flew successfully in 1944. A jet-powered prototype followed in early 1945, proving the concept worked. Then American forces found the third prototype sitting unfinished in a Gotha factory, crated it up, and shipped it to the United States. When the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum later analyzed the aircraft, engineers discovered the wing's skin contained charcoal dust mixed into its wood composite. Some researchers believe this was a crude radar-absorbing material, a stealth concept the United States would not officially develop until the B-2 Spirit bomber decades later. The Smithsonian still holds the only surviving example. Number 9. The Graf Zeppelin. Most people know the United States won the Pacific Naval War partly through aircraft carriers. Fewer know Nazi Germany came terrifyingly close to fielding one too. The Graf Zeppelin was Germany's only aircraft carrier attempt, about 260 meters long and designed to carry over 40 warplanes. Had she been completed, she could have shifted the balance of power in European waters. Construction began in 1936 and reached roughly 85% completion before stalling. The German Air Force under Göring refused to cooperate with naval aviation plans. Territorial disputes between the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine made agreement impossible, and shifting priorities kept pulling resources away. She sat unfinished through most of the war, a monument to internal dysfunction inside a regime that prided itself on discipline and total control. In 1945, German forces scuttled her to prevent Soviet capture. The Soviets raised her, used her as a weapons testing target, then sank her again in 1947. Her wreck lay forgotten on the Baltic Sea floor until rediscovered in 2006. She never launched a single aircraft in combat. She never fired a gun in anger. She came close to changing the war, then disappeared beneath the waves. Number 8. Bunkers of the Channel Islands. The Channel Islands sit just off the coast of France and are British Crown dependencies. They were the only part of the British Isles Germany occupied during the war, from June 1940 to May 1945. Hitler was convinced they had to be held at any cost, pouring resources into the islands far beyond any rational strategic calculation and ordering fortifications that made the Channel Islands the most heavily fortified territory per square kilometer in all of occupied Europe. The construction, carried out largely by organization-taught slave laborers brought from across occupied Europe and the Soviet Union, produced a staggering volume of concrete infrastructure. Hundreds of bunkers, artillery casemates, anti-tank walls, underground hospitals, observation towers, gun batteries, and a complete underground military railway tunnel system on Alderney. When British forces liberated the islands in May 1945, just days after Germany's formal surrender, they found fortifications so thoroughly embedded into the landscape that many simply could not be removed. Dozens of bunkers still sit in the cliffs and fields of the islands today, many open to the public. The scale of what Germany built on British soil, and the conditions under which it was built, remains one of the most sobering physical legacies of the entire occupation. Number 7. The Jagdtiger. If you ever wanted proof that the Nazis sometimes built weapons more terrifying in theory than in practice, the Jagdtiger is your answer. At 72 tons, it was the heaviest armored fighting vehicle of the entire war. Its main armament, a 128mm gun, could theoretically destroy Allied tanks from over 3 kilometers away. The front armor was nearly 250mm thick, making it impervious to most of what the Allies could throw at it. On paper, it was practically unstoppable. In the field, it was a mechanical nightmare. Built on an extended Tiger II chassis already known for unreliability, the Jagdtiger's sheer mass meant engines overheated regularly, transmissions failed under the strain, and moving it across bridges or soft ground was a logistical problem that often had no clean solution. Fuel consumption was enormous in a Germany already running critically short of almost everything. Crews sometimes abandoned their Jagdtigers not because the enemy destroyed them, but because they simply couldn't keep them running. Only around 80 were ever produced, and very few saw sustained combat. Each surviving Jagdtiger sitting in a museum today is less a symbol of German engineering triumph and more a monument to overreach. Number 6. Cyclosarin. You have probably heard of sarin, you might have heard of tabun, but cyclosarin is the nerve agent most people cannot name, and it may be the most dangerous one the Nazis developed. It came from the same source as the others, Gerhard Schrader, a chemist whose search for a better pesticide accidentally produced the G-series nerve agents. What makes cyclosarin distinctly alarming is its persistence. Most nerve agents evaporate quickly or pool in obvious liquid form. Cyclosarin sits in between, a clear, oily liquid with a sweet smell that evaporates slowly, lingering for hours or days after deployment. It attacks the same nerve signaling mechanism as the others, but its slower evaporation means it contaminates an area long after initial contact. Skin exposure can be just as deadly as inhalation. Like tabun and sarin, the Nazis stockpiled cyclosarin but never deployed it, driven by fear of Allied retaliation rather than moral restraint. Its existence did not stay locked in German vaults. Iraq deployed it during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, combining it with sarin for compounded effect. A substance created while searching for a better pesticide became a weapon of mass destruction used decades after the war ended. Number 5. Methadone. Most people know methadone as a treatment for opioid addiction, used in clinics worldwide to help people rebuild their lives. Almost nobody knows where it came from. In 1939, chemists at IG Farben synthesized a compound called Va10820. Not for healing. Germany was running out of morphine, and Nazi leadership needed full independence from foreign opium supplies. Gustav Erhardt and Max Bockmuhl produced a fully synthetic opioid that mimicked morphine's effects, but could be manufactured entirely from chemicals within the Reich. Early testing revealed serious side effects, and the drug never became standard issue. It sat in obscurity through most of the war until Germany fell and American forces seized the patents. It was commercialized in the United States under the brand name Dolofine, derived from Latin words for pain and end. By 1947, it was renamed Methadone and entering broader medical use. Today, it sits on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines and saves lives across the world. But it began as a cold calculation by a totalitarian state waging war without foreign dependencies. Number 4. Thuringia tunnels. In 1944, as Allied bombing reduced German surface factories to rubble, the SS and the Armaments Ministry launched an aggressive program to move critical war production underground. Across the forested hills of Thuringia in central Germany, slave laborers were forced to blast tunnels and galleries into the rock, some expanding old mines, others cut fresh. The goal was simple: put the factories below ground so bombs couldn't touch them. The Johannisthal Valley near Arnstadt became the site of a project called Siegfried, a planned Führerhauptquartier, or command headquarters, rivaling anything else built during the war. Forced laborers from multiple concentration camp subcamps were worked to death carving out vast underground spaces that were never completed. When American forces moved through Thuringia in April 1945, what they documented in these tunnels unfinished production lines, evidence of catastrophic working conditions, tools abandoned mid-use, and in some cases the bodies of workers who had died and simply been left gave investigators an immediate and visceral picture of how the Nazi war machine had operated in its final phase. Much of what was discovered in Thuringia fed directly into the Nuremberg prosecution's case against SS and armaments leadership. Number 3. Operation Bernhard's counterfeit finds. Inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin, a special workshop ran from early 1943 to early 1945, producing what are considered among the finest counterfeit banknotes ever made. Codenamed Operation Bernhard, after its SS overseer Major Bernhard Kruger, The program coerced skilled Jewish prisoners, including engravers, typesetters, printers, and bank clerks, into working the presses under constant threat of death. Conservative estimates put the total face value of counterfeit British pound notes produced at around £130 million. The original plan was to drop the fake currency over Britain to flood and destabilize the economy. That stage was never executed. Instead, the notes funded SS intelligence operations, paid foreign agents, and purchased black market goods across occupied Europe. The counterfeit sterling even paid a Turkish spy codenamed Cicero, who was passing secrets from inside the British embassy in Ankara, and helped fund the raid that freed Benito Mussolini from Italian custody in September 1943. When the war ended, the SS ordered the printing plates, machinery, and remaining notes thrown into Lake Toplitz in Austria. Divers have recovered crates of counterfeit notes from that lake over subsequent decades. The plates themselves were never found. Number 2. Dora-Mittelbau tunnels. In the autumn of 1943, the SS established a concentration camp inside the Kuhnstein mountain near Nordhausen in central Germany. It was initially a subcamp of Buchenwald and later became the independent Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, and it existed for one purpose: to build V-2 rockets underground using the bodies of human beings as disposable labor. Roughly 60,000 prisoners passed through Mittelbau-Dora between its founding and the liberation in April 1945. In the first months, workers were not even permitted to leave the tunnel system. They slept in 4-level wooden bunk frames hammered into the rock walls of the lateral galleries, with no sanitation, limited food, and constant exposure to explosive dust and exhaust from underground machinery. Estimates of the death toll from the full Mittelbau-Dora complex range from 16,000 to 20,000 people. When American forces entered the tunnels in April 1945, they found a fully operational rocket factory carved into a mountain, 2 parallel main tunnels, each about 1 mile long, connected by dozens of lateral galleries, with completed V-2 rockets still sitting on assembly stands. The rockets were shipped to the United States for testing. The lead engineer of the V-2 program, Wernher von Braun, would go on to design the Saturn V rocket that carried Apollo 11 to the moon. Number 1. Hitler's bunker in Berlin. On April 30, 1945, roughly 8.5 meters below the garden of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler shot himself. The Soviet Red Army found the bunker within days. What they walked into was the physical endpoint of the entire war. The complex had been built in 2 phases. First, in 1936 as a temporary air raid shelter, then dramatically expanded in 1944 into a 30-room subterranean command center. It consisted of 2 levels. The upper section, called the Vorbunker, dated to 1936. The deeper Führerbunker, completed in 1944, had reinforced concrete ceilings 4 meters thick. Inside were Hitler's private quarters, a map room, Eva Braun's adjoining rooms, staff quarters, a telephone exchange, and a medical station. The entire structure was self-contained with its own ventilation, water, and electrical systems. When Soviet soldiers moved through it, they found personal belongings, documents, medications, and the physical evidence of the final days. The Soviets were so determined to prevent it becoming a shrine that they demolished the remaining chancellery above ground. The bunker itself was partially demolished in 1959 and further reduced in 1988. Today, the site sits under a mundane Berlin parking lot marked by a single small informational sign. Which of these discoveries do you think had the biggest impact on the world after the war ended? Share your ideas in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.